Hello and welcome to this lecture. My name is Ted Winroth. I'm a psychologist, criminologist and psychotherapist practicing in Sweden. I have done some work at Luleå University, Umeå University, Lund University, and this is a lecture which I will mainly heavily criticize Sigmund Freud and the theories of Sigmund Freud. And I've named this lecture Schiaparelli and Freud, and I will explain why. Schiaparelli was an astronomer who was contemporary with Sigmund Freud, and he made a series of very interesting mistakes and logical fallacies, and those mistakes are very valuable because I will argue that Freud made many similar mistakes, and we can learn a lot from the mistakes of Schiaparelli and apply those corrections into the very theory work of Freud. Now, I'm pretty sure that none of you listening to this or watching this are actually familiar with Schiaparelli and Schiaparelli's theory about space. And I don't blame you, because Schiaparelli, his theory, his astronomical theory was just plain wrong. Flat Earth wrong. And Schiaparelli's theory is on the cemetery of bad ideas. However, we can dig it up and we can investigate it. And I will argue that Freud's theory is about to end up the same way. So let's have a look. On the right we have Giovanni Schiaparelli. On the left you have Sigmund Freud. Like I said, they were contemporary. Now, Giovanni Schiaparelli, there's a lot to be said about him, and I will not waste more time than I have to about this. Schiaparelli was actually a pretty good astronomer, and we have to show him some respect, because some of the work he did was good, sound astronomy, the way they could do it back then. He won some awards and stuff like that. Now, what turned out to be one of Schiaparelli's greatest contributions, you put that in brackets, he said that whenever he looked in his telescope at the planet Mars, he could see what he called in Italian canali. Now, canali translates a bit badly and a bit roughly to canals, like the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal. Now, that's not what he actually said, but he was claiming that he saw rivers and lakes on the surface of the planet Mars. And back then it was pretty much impossible to do photography. So what he did was that he looked into his telescope and he made these amazing drawings by hand of how those rivers were, all over the surface of planet Mars. And an American astronomer named Lowell, he just got really hyped up about this whole thing. And Schiaparelli, he retired because he got bad eyesight, and as an astronomer back then, you really needed to have good eyes. So Lowell, he brought that theory even further, and he was looking at Mars himself through his telescope, and he would claim that these canals were actual real canals, like man-made, if you put man in brackets. And that became a huge breeding ground for all these theories about life on Mars, and it became inspiration for those War of the World books and all that later on became a Tom Cruise movie. And at the time, there was a lot of people believing this. It was almost like a fact, and you had lots of people arguing and saying, of course there's life on Mars, we can see their canals and stuff like that. Now there's here's just a few pictures of it. These are some of the sketches. This is Lowell here. Now, another contemporary astronomer named Vincenzo Cirulli, he got really skeptical about this. And he suspected that those canals that Giovanni was seeing in his telescope, they were just actually optical illusions. And he was right. Some good eye doctors and telescope experts, they took a very close look at Schiaparelli's old telescope that's in a museum somewhere, and they realized that the telescope had what is called an ophthalmoscopic ability. That's a fancy word for saying you can see your own blood vessels in your own fucking eye. pardon my language. It turns out that all those years Schiaparelli sat there and was making these drawings, he was actually drawing his own eyes. So these canali here are just shadows from the blood vessels in his own eyeball. Now, we can't really explain this whole crazy situation by just blaming it on the blood vessels in the eyeballs. There are some psychosocial factors to play with here. There are like peer pressure and expectations, and there are also other cognitive illusions and stuff like that. And if you really want to go into the details there, you can look at this article by Matthew J. Sharps from Skeptical Inquirer. He made, I think, a really good investigation of this. And here we just got some, funny examples of how these different canali maps looked, and there was actually some arguments among these different astronomers who believed in this theory. So they would waste a lot of time making these maps and trying to map out, and it was just really a wild goose chase in space. A Swedish science historian named Peter Lausson, who I think is an excellent historian, he commented on this whole era, and he said the channels on Mars were not the result of wild fantasies, but by complex and convincing illusions which many intelligent and competent people fell for. This is my own translation, I might add. Now, like I said, the canali hypothesis is dead in the ground, and the body is cold as ice. The corpse is cold as ice. When we had the first Mars rovers, the first robots and spaceships going to Mars, when we could actually photograph the surface of Mars at a somewhat close distance with these droids here, the right one I think is the Viking droid, the left one is the rover, whatever, I'm sorry, I'm not so sure about their names, but when we actually could photograph the surface of Mars, we did not find any single bloody canal. And that was hopefully the last nail in the coffin, because the canali theory had been slowly dying for a long time as the telescopes got better and better and better. And I might add that many of these canal proponents, they refused to look in other telescopes than their own. At the time, I found this map on Wikipedia. We see a number of different Mars rovers. Some of them are some of them are broken, and some of them are still operating. And this yellow here is about to be launched. Just a funny detail is that one of the rovers is baptized Schiaparelli. Now, of course, there's a lot about the planet Mars we do not know. We have a lot to discover and investigate there. But one thing we know for bloody sure is that there are no canals. Now, there was a Swedish professor, I'm not sure his subject, I think it was a professor of psychology, but I can't swear to it. He was in a television debate in Swedish television back in the early 1990s. And there was this whole satanic panic, ritual abuse, incest, disaster business, and the whole shebang of repressed memories and all that. And this professor, Max Scharnberg, he was very, very critical and skeptical to the whole repressed memories thing. And in that debate, he said, there's a line running through all of psychology as sharp as the line between astronomy and astrology. Now, there's a Swedish psychologist named Billy Larsson. He wrote about this in 2002, and he did a very avid, very meticulous going through the works of Freud's and the critique of Freud. And he wrote this way very succinctly and I think powerfully: all scientists make mistakes. But in Freud's case, there's too many peculiarities, distortions and lies to call them mistakes. These so-called mistakes are actually intentional, systematical, and driven by an agenda. They're part of a strategy to hide the fact that Freud has no empirical support for his most basic theories. It's in fact himself whom has created the very data he then used to support his theories. Cioffi, a famous Freud critique, was right, and Freud's claims to be scientific, or Freud to be a scientist, must be disqualified. Freud's inability to make real observations has been brilliantly summarized with this phrase: Freud mistook a mirror for a window. There's no better way to summarize Freud, and once again I'd like to add, this is my translation. Now, this is my main argument. Freud is the Schiaparelli of psychology. And though the mistake Schiaparelli did can be sort of explained optically, perhaps not Freud's, but still there is a striking similarity in how wrong they were and how bad they were working. So let's take a look at the details. Like we all know, the devil is in the details. So I've taken a number of strong arguments against Freud, and I put them into 3 categories. The first category is: experiments supporting Freud's models are rare. Most experiments trying to investigate his claim have unwanted results. Usually the data coming out of the experiments is actually weakening the model and the theory. Second category: brain research has not converged with Freud's models and theories. Third category: Freud was a liar and a cheater. Now, we're going to go into specifics and we're going to talk about some details. So let's start out with the very first category. I'm afraid this is in Swedish. I will translate it roughly as I read. This is the Swedish medical journal for all the Swedish doctors. This is an article from 2005. And it goes: it all started with an attempt to show that Freud was right. Aaron Beck developed cognitive therapy. For about 50 years ago, the American psychiatrist Aaron Beck developed a new type of psychotherapy as an alternative to the, at the time, psychoanalysis, which was dominating. Today, it has been shown that cognitive therapy has effect against depression and anxiety, among other things. But the whole thing started with an attempt to prove that Freud was right. Aaron Beck disclosed this in an interview when he visited Sweden that year. What Freud argued that depressed people repressed bad memories, like failing an exam or being dumped by a girlfriend or something like that. Now, if that theory, if that hypothesis, is correct, you could somehow find that depressed people don't have easy access to these bad memories. This is what Aaron tested, and it turned out to be the exactly opposite. And now we are pretty sure about this. Of course, this is psychology. We're not doing physics here. There's always going to be these really hard questions about this. But at the moment, I would say there's some very, very, very strong scientific consensus that depressed people, they over-access their bad memories. Another example is the famous Freudian slip, that whenever you mispronounce or misspell something and it turns out to be something lewd, something naughty, something aggressive, that's just a manifestation of your inner sexuality and aggression. There's been also some funny research on that. There's a great book out there called Everybody Lies, and there's some very good researchers at Google. They took a look at that. They analyzed a lot of mispronunciations, and they just could not find data that we prefer these pornographic or lewd mispronunciations or misspellings before just regular good old-fashioned mistakes. So I could go on and on, I will not, but this is one of the first main arguments against Freud. There's just the data coming in doesn't support the theory. Just the same way the Mars rovers couldn't find the bloody canals, we can't really find in our experiments what the hell Freud was talking about. Now, second category, brain research has not converged with Freud's models and theories. Right, let's go for another example here. Freud said that whenever we're dreaming, those dreams are actually your repressed aggressive or sexual urges. So let's say you're dreaming that you open a lock with a key. Well, you're really dreaming about sex. The key being your penis and the lock being the vagina or whatever you prefer. Sure, be that as it may, but let's try to investigate here. Let's look into the details. Now, first of all, I don't know about you guys, but I'll gladly admit, I've had a lot of wet dreams in my days. I've had a lot of dreams where I'm, pardon my French, fucking. Now, that creates a very funny catch-22, doesn't it? Now, so if I'm dreaming about opening doors with a key, so does that mean that when I'm dreaming I'm fucking? That I'm actually dreaming on opening a door with a key? Or what the hell is going on there? It just becomes this absurd self-contradiction here that doesn't make much sense at all. And hey, also when it comes to aggression, you know, I used to do a lot of martial arts when I was younger, and I tell you, I was dreaming karate every night. Here's a text from the book by Scott Lilienfeld, 50 Myths of Psychology, I think it's called. Indeed, close inspection of dream reports reveal that many dreams don't appear to be disguised by symbols. Indeed, in the early stages of sleep, before your eyes begin to dart back and forth in rapid eye movement, most of our dreams mirror the everyday activities and concerns that occupy our minds, like studying for a test, shopping for groceries, or doing our taxes. During REM sleep, our highly activated brains produce dreams that are sometimes illogical and charged with emotion. Does this occur because repressed material from the id somehow escapes censorship? Psychiatrist Alan Hobson doesn't think so. In fact, Hobson's theory of dreaming, which has garnered considerable scientific support, is so radically different from Freud's that some have called him the anti-Freud. Starting in the 60s and the 70s, the Harvard Laboratory of Neurophysiology, Hobson, along with Robert McCarley, developed the activation synthesis theory, which tied dreams to brain activity rather than the symbolic expression of unconscious wishes. If you compare Freud's theory with Darwin's theory, for instance, Darwin's theory, when it was published, it had some minor, gaps. There were some pieces of the puzzle missing. There were things that Darwin couldn't really explain, but he said, if my theory is correct, if science is advancing as it should, my theory will only grow stronger, and further investigations and discoveries will just fix these gaps. And that's exactly what happened. So, ever since he published his first draft of The Origin of Species, all the genetic science and all the hereditary science and biology and zoology and everything just adds to it, and it's like a big tree just growing and getting stronger every day. If you compare that with what's going on with Freud, it's the absolute opposite. Every major finding we do, every discovery in brain research, dream research, sleep research, sex research, whatever we're doing, it's almost every time making that Freudian scaffold to just collapse. And so, good theory stands the test of time. Freud does not stand the test of time. Sorry. Now, we're going into the final part of the arguments against Freud, and that is a very ad hominem. It's an attack on his personality. I'll go back to the whole brain research thing. There's one more thing I'd like to mention. For instance, we have these phenomena. They have a phenomena called Capgras syndrome, and there's another about foot fetishism. And if you go back to the old psychoanalytical explanations of these syndromes, they just seem really, really silly and bad if you compare them to the more modern explanations. For instance, Capgras syndrome is patients waking up they had a stroke or something, they look at their mom and they go, "You're not my mother, you're an imposter, you're a doppelganger, you're not my mother." Now, the psychoanalytical explanation of this was that you have so much repressed incestuous urges, you really want to, fuck your mother, and you can't handle all that, the whole Oedipal thing. So you repress the fact that your mother is your mother. Problem solved. Now that's one explanation. Now, a more modern explanation proposed by the neurologist Ramachandran is that there is actually an injury going on in the face recognition center of the brain. The face memory is somehow intact, the patient can see the mother, but the connection between the emotional center of the brain, the amygdala, and the face recognition area of the brain is broken. So you get a cognitive recognition of your mother's face, but you do not get that emotional validation that your mother is your mother. So you get this paradox, and the only logical explanation at the time is that your mother is not your mother, she's an imposter. If you look at foot fetishism, the Freudian explanation is that the foot represents a penis and you're repressing your penis urges or whatever, so you go horny if someone is touching your feet. Ramachandra also gives another explanation to this. His explanation is that if you look closely into the sensoric parts of your brain where your brain registers touch on your body, the feet and the genitals are neighbors. So what you actually get with these foot fetish people is a synesthesia effect, a kinetic synesthesia effect, that whenever the foot gets activated, you kind of feel it in your genitals, and vice versa. There is this hilarious case of a woman who had her leg amputated, she had a lot of phantom limb, and whenever she had sex, she would not only have her orgasms in her genitalia, she would also have orgasms in her phantom foot. Now, I suggest that you take out this big scale and you put one explanation in one of the scales and the other in the other side of the scale, and you will probably agree with me that some of these explanations are just really bad, they got no weight to them, and more modern explanations are really more solid and they bring a lot more science to the table. Now, let's go on to Freud as a person. Now, before I go into this personality attack of his persona, I am fully aware, and I'd just like to really make a statement here that ad hominem critique has in all fairness, it has nothing to do in the fields of science. For instance, you can have some really amazing scientists who turned out to be awful people. My prime example is Carlton Gajdusek, an amazing doctor who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for discoveries of prions. He was a brilliant scientist, but he was also a proud pedophile who raped some of his adoptive children. So yeah, he's a, sorry my French, fucking asshole, but he was a good scientist. You can't deny him that. However, Freud, his flaws as a human being, they seeped into his so-called scientific process. And here's, for instance, this historian named Frederick Crews. He's done some really good investigation into Freud. I really recommend the book. You can get oodles of details and information there. A doctor named Harriet Hall, she did a very good summarization of this book, and she wrote, few of his ideas were original, that is Freud. He plagiarized, he borrowed ideas from rivals, but then backdated them and treated them as his own. His debt to others were originally acknowledged, but eventually suppressed in favor of the specious appeal to clinical expertise. He was actively evasive, malicious, and dishonest in covering up his mistakes. Crews, the author, relates many instances where he rewrote history, changing the story to put himself in a better light. We are dealing with distortion here. We are dealing with fraud. And let's just bring another case to the table, which I think is quite amazing. We will talk about the case of Penkaev. Now, before I go into this text, which is from another great book named Psychology Gone Wrong by Witkowski, a Polish psychology professor, let me just briefly talk about the case of the Wolfman. Freud had a patient he nicknamed the Wolfman. It turned out, allegedly, it was a young man who was suffering from this strange hallucination that he saw wolves everywhere. And Freud claimed that some bullshit, blah, 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 that the wolves repressed his penis or whatever, the screw that. And he somehow cured him with this psychoanalysis, and he became a happy, young, healthy man. Now, that was just a fat lie. The real Wolfman, his name was Penkaev, and some journalist found him in Australia, like in the 80s or so, and he was a really old man. And this journalist, she figured it out, and she was like, "Oh my God, you're the Wolfman!" And at first, he did not want to speak to her. So she really had to twist his arm, and this is what she wrote about it. Unfortunately, the reality is a bit disappointing, because Freud's alleged success in treating Penkaev was a lie. The aristocrat, that is Penkaev, still suffered from the very same fears and obsessions that made him visit Freud in the first place. He suffered from them for the rest of his life. He used the service of many psychoanalysts and was hospitalized multiple times without any effect. When the journalist finally reached him, she discovered that Penkaev was receiving a regular monthly payment from an association of psychoanalysts' salary for keeping his mouth shut. It's so bad. It turns out that it wasn't only Freud who was the fraud. Freud's children and associates and a lot of people who are supposed to carry his legacy were crooked themselves as well. So we're dealing with a heritage of lies upon distortion, and in all honesty, shouldn't this whole Freud thing be gone by now? Shouldn't it be dead by now? The same way we just laugh at Schiaparelli. So what's going on here? Well, of course, I realize that it's a bit more complicated than just, lining it up like the Canali hypothesis, but we're going to look into some of the problems here. This is just a picture to illustrate how the very foundations of psychoanalysis is just a foundation of sand, and the whole thing should have collapsed by now. Now, very common protest objection I get is that people say, well, I went to psychotherapy, psychodynamic therapy, Freudian therapy, whatever, and it helped me. Yes, and please, let me be personal for a minute here. I'm a psychologist. I studied at the University of Umeå, and before that I have a master's degree in psychology at Luleå University, and then I also did psychotherapist program at Lund University. Now, when I did my psychologist training, I learned both CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and PDT, psychodynamic therapy. I've studied both the theory and the practice of psychodynamic and psychoanalytic theory. I have not done that much treatment myself. I have done a few treatments of psychodynamic therapy, and I have myself gone. I've been a patient for about 50 hours in psychodynamic therapy, and I agree. Yes, I've seen patients getting helped by psychodynamic therapy. I was helped. Me personally experienced that psychodynamic therapy helped me. But that does not prove that Freud was right. We're going to have to look into some details there, so I'm going to skip ahead to this slide here. This dude is James Lind. James Lind was the doctor who discovered the cure for scurvy. Now, scurvy, if you're not familiar with it, it's a horrible disease. It killed like millions of people back in the days. Mostly sailors got scurvy. Their teeth would be falling out. They were bleeding from their gums. They would die. And what James Lind did, he did like one of the first real clinical trials in medicine history. And he thought that the cure for scurvy was that you consumed sour things, sour tasting objects, like cider, vinegar, diluted sulfurous acid, lime, stuff like that. Because he believed that if you soured your body, if you got your pH levels low, the disease just wouldn't catch you. So he took these sailors and he put them in groups, and they all had scurvy, and one group was given really sour cider, and one group was given vinegar, and one group was given diluted sulfurous acid. And it turned out that, like, the cider group, they got a little better, but just very little. The vinegar didn't help at all. The diluted sulfurs didn't help at all. But the lime group, oh my God, they got treated. That treatment worked like a charm. They recovered their health with flying colors. Now, initially, James Lind didn't really believe his own results. He was just super puzzled. Now, Lind never understood why the lime method worked. He never did. And it wasn't until we started to understand vitamins that we understood what the hell was going on. Scurvy is vitamin C deficiency. So it had nothing to do with the sourness. It was all about the vitamins. And this is a very common thing that can happen when we study the history of medicine. Here's a Swedish psychiatrist and historian of medicine named Uddenberg, and he's written very, very nice books about this. And he said, we know that a lot of successful medical procedures were based on completely faulty models and theories. So yeah, let's have a look at these complications that some people hold on to the psychodynamic method. Now, first of all, that the fact that you experience improvement in therapy can actually be an illusion. It can be a placebo effect of sorts. There's been some really good research on this by Lilienfeld. I highly recommend this article. And Lilienfeld and his colleagues, they managed to identify 26 different factors that can explain how illusions of therapy efficiency appear. Just to mention a few of them: the placebo effect, you have the sunk cost fallacy, you have regression to the mean, and you have, of course, spontaneous remission. A lot of mental disorders or whatever, they just go away. Now, that can be one side of the coin, but there's a flip side to the coin. And if you go back to the whole scurvy thing again, like those patients who got treated with scurvy, that was not some bloody illusion. That was a real goddamn improvement. Now, people being improved by psychodynamic therapy, is it an illusion or is it a real effect? Well, to be perfectly honest, it's hard to know at the moment. But it's very, 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 very important that we research that. So my argument is, let's find the vitamins of psychodynamic therapy. I do believe there are vitamins in the psychodynamic therapy, and I do believe we need them. We need to understand what these therapy vitamins are, and we need them. There's a lot of scurvy, mental scurvy out there. But that's... If we're holding on to these goddamn stupid old ideas about the whole Freudian bullshit, that's actually going to be an obstacle. That's going to be like driving with your brakes on. So that's let's find the vitamins in psychodynamic therapy. Thank you.